Today I'm going to talk about a topic that I'm extremely passionate about, which is solar panel recycling. So for the last, I would say, 25 years, all we've been doing is basically focusing on producing more panels, using more resources, without necessarily thinking about what the hell we're going to do with those panels when they come to their end of life. And I think it's a gold mine in itself because it's got a huge amount of very valuable and critical materials. But the key is how to do it in a way that it has a huge amount of more integrity, and how to deal with it in a way that is economical and that can yield to better results. So I'm going to share my vision with you today. I'm a climate entrepreneur. I founded a group called the Longevity Partners Group, which was one of the fastest growing sustainability advisory businesses in the world. We went from 20 people to about 220 people in the space of 24 months. We've got offices pretty much everywhere, but I've stepped down as the CEO of the group. I'm now a board member to transition and actually focus on something that I'm equally passionate about, which is what we're going to talk about today. So I'll talk about, I've put a few slides together to talk about the current scale of the industry, the risk of sending it to landfill, the environmental cost of making solar panels. A lot of the stuff that we talked about today, there's going to be not quite a repetition, but there's clearly, I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into it. The scale of the issue, the methodologies that are being used today, are they right for tomorrow? And there's also a huge timing issue when it comes to solar panel recycling. The requirements from off-takers, and I'll talk about what the future looks like and the vision. My other mission is to keep you awake, because I know that it's 3 o'clock, and I hope that I can keep you guys entertained. So it's a huge problem, right? At the end of 2022, there was about 1 terawatt of solar. At the end of 2024, there was 2.2 terawatts of solar. That means that, the installations of solar are just exponential. We are, at the moment, adding about, 600 gigs of solar every year. That's going to ramp up to about 1 terawatt by the end of the decade. So there's going to be 1 terawatt of solar installed globally. So that represents a huge amount of waste that currently doesn't necessarily have a solution for. When you build a nuclear plant, before you build your plant, you need to have 2 things. You need to have supply of fuel, so you need to supply your uranium beforehand for the duration of the lifetime of the plant. And you also need to have a decommissioning program. Whereas for solar, there's not necessarily, there's a pot of money that's put aside for decommissioning in the best case of scenarios, but there isn't necessarily a plan for where the panels are going to go and how they're going to be recycled, and making sure that the way that those panels are going to be recycled match, what we call impact investment criteria, because that's also something where, the way that I think the world works is you've got a huge amount of pension funds money, institutional investors passing on those investments, those pensioners' money into asset management firms. These are the BlackRock, the Blackstones of this world, the Macquarie and the Brookfield. And these will then go and install and deploy a huge amount of money into what we call today infrastructure funds, and real estate, et cetera, but all sorts of different investment products. When you invest in renewable energy, a lot of these guys qualify those investments as impact investments, and they do it by virtue of just attracting more capital. They say, if you invest with me, I will deploy it in a way that is responsible, in a way that is ethical, in a way that is great. But there's one caveat that people didn't think about, is if you don't actually recycle your solar panels, you're actually in breach of all those fiduciary duties that you said you would do in the first place. So, there's also a risk of inaction associated with, not having a direct solution. And today, 90% of organizations don't have a solution. So going back to my slides, about 1 terawatt annually will be added. And by the end of the decade, there'll be about 6.7 terawatts of solar, which is basically about 641 million ton of waste. So it's a huge amount. And if we look at the amount of additional waste that will be added, by mid-century in 2050, I'll talk about it later, you'll need to basically, the volume is about a third of the Everest mountain every year. So every 3 years, the volume is the Everest mountain, which is quite a cool stat, I find myself. So the current landscape of the solar industry, now versus 2030 or at the end of 2024, you can see that it's still very much dominated by China. And obviously, China is very opaque in terms of solar panel recycling. Nobody really knows what's going on over there. But it's certainly a challenge. And we know that they're very advanced when it comes to manufacturing and processing and robotics, et cetera. So it's, we should hope that they're going to do something about it. But what we can see that's quite interesting, I don't quite know. I'm actually going to talk about laser later, but I don't know where the laser is on this one. Oh, yeah, here we go. We can see that the share of global renewables is reducing in Europe and increasing in North America. So that's basically the trend and where things are going. Obviously, Africa, Middle East, and Latin America and Oceania is also growing. So what's the real risk of sending the panels to landfill? So the main risk is contamination. So you've got an environmental risk through leaching, which is mainly from the cadmium, telluride, the lead, the copper, indium, gallium, selenide, CIGS films. And that leaching cannot be permitted just because it has a negative impact on the environment. But I think the biggest systemic issue with that is that you would be in breach of your European taxonomy, SFDR impact investment requirements. So, for example, if you have an infrastructure fund that invests primarily in renewable energy, and that you're basically having a negative, what we call do not significant harm to the environment, that's the concept of do not significant harm, you can actually be in breach of your SFDR regulation. And what you can get on the back of that is claims of greenwashing, and also we've seen with Deutsche Bank, DWS, a few years ago, when they had a claim of greenwashing, the share price went down by 13%. So, you can have basically one project that really takes down a big chunk of your the value. So if there's any sort of large-scale investors in the room or infrastructure investors, that's one that you need to take into account. So we talked a little bit about, a lot of people that think that solar panels are super green, but they're not necessarily super green. So I wanted to talk about that today a little bit. And also you have different types of solar panels. So I think we talked about it a little bit earlier on the total embedded carbon associated with manufacturing those panels. And you can see that actually monocrystalline silicon is quite high up in terms of, the embedded carbon in, from those. We also talked earlier about, the amount of land and the density of power production. And you can see that solar PV has a big, obviously 0.3 would be for rooftop PV installations, but you can see that actually the required area in terms of square meter per megawatt hour is one of the largest out there. The second largest after solar concentrated, and then obviously, hydropower plants and biomass plant. But if you compare it to the wind turbines, the coal-fired plants, the gas-fired plants, the nuclear power plants, it uses a lot more land mass. So that's how it compares in terms of the life cycle of installations. So, the gas plants are better than the coal-fired plants. So that's the magnitude. But then here you can see that monocrystalline silicon is actually, has got a higher LCA compared to wind, nuclear, geothermal. And the reason for that is because of the extraction of those materials, right? It's all about the extraction of silicon that requires like heavy processes. But once you recycle those materials, and once those recycled materials are reintegrated in the manufacturing, systems, then that changes everything. That makes the solar PV one of the greenest out there, and that's kind of, the vision for this project. So the scale of the issue is going to be exponential from 2035. So you can see here at the moment, there's what I call the replacement tonnage. So we don't necessarily see it like that, but solar panels do break, or they're faulty, or people on the installation teams break them when imagine you have a pallet that falls off the truck, and you still need to do something with those panels. And that's the replacement cost. That's the replacement tonnage, which is about 0.4% of all installed capacity. So that means that by the end of the decade, by 2030, there's going to be 0.4% of 1 terawatt of solar panels that will need to be replaced. And that's kind of warranty claims, manufacturing defects and early failures, installation damage, but also weather damage. So what people don't really think about, it's the hailstorms, it's the tornadoes, the winds, and every time that you've got an extreme weather event, your installation, which is basically in a rural area, is also subject to being damaged, and that basically creates a bit of feedstock. So at the moment, last year, it was about 150,000 tons of solar panels that needs to be recycled. I think the actual needs, if you split them per region, are a bit higher, but there's a lot that gets diverted and gets to landfill. But by the end of 2034, so by 2035, it's basically 25 years after the first panels were kind of installed. And in Europe, certainly it was 2010. It started a tiny bit earlier in Germany. But what you can see in the total installed capacity in the world is that in 2010, you had 57 gigawatts of total installed capacity. That was a huge gap, that went from almost not to, maybe 3 gigawatts to about 57 gigawatts in total. And all these panels globally will need to be recycled. So that's basically that big bump. And you see that actually solar panel recycling requirements up until 2035, it's kind of sleeping giant, right? It's got, it's kind of not very much. It's, you've got 150,000 tons. You're going to have 0.41 terawatts. So the more we install, the more there's going to be requirements. You've got climate risk associated with it. So therefore, that's going to create an immediate need. But really, the bulk of the issue is when you start getting to 2035. And that's just absolutely exponential, because that's the amount of solar panels that we installed every year. So you need to actually create a system to anticipate what to do with it. In 30 years, by 2055, it'll be the equivalent of, I mentioned a third of the Everest every year, but that's also equivalent of 9,000 Olympic swimming pools, if you want to take something. So at the moment, the tonnage of recycling requirements is about, it's all about the replacement. But in 2035, that sort of completely inverted. So the bulk of it will be end of life. And you will see that because of the increased number of installations by 2035, that replacement level kind of comes down. So at the moment, a lot of replacements due to warranty, weather, panels being broken on site, and then moving straight to full end of life. So how are the solar panels recycled? So people sometimes say, hey, it's difficult to recycle solar panels. I've heard, oh, it's impossible to recycle solar panels. Actually, that's not true. You can recycle solar panels down to more than 95% of, some companies reach 99.5%. But the key is not necessarily to, have the highest level of, percentage of recycling, which is a big problem to resolve. So it's already a good thing compared to not doing anything. But the real key is to how you reintegrate each of the materials and repackage them so that you can get the maximum value out of them. And there's a lot of, in the panels you have silver, which is trading at $1.5 million a ton at the moment. You have, obviously depending if they're CDT panels, but obviously you've got the silicon, you've got the aluminum, you've got the copper, and then you've got some, in some cases in inverters, you've got some rare earths and, antimony as well, which is a critical mineral for the defense industry. So the idea is to have the ability, through science, essentially, to extract those materials to make sure that you create a sustainable supply chain for the United States and other countries, so that we're not entirely reliable on China for importing all these technologies. We have the ability, now the materials have been mined and they're in this country, we have the ability to basically reutilize them and dispatch them in loads of different supply chains to actually have a what I call material sovereignty or more independence. So what's being done at the moment, you've got a thermal recycling, mechanical recycling, chemical recycling, and then there's something very new that's kind of just been discovered, or there's only a couple of institutions in the world that are looking at it, and that's the installation, that's the technology that I'm really interested in for my new project, which is laser ablation. So you can actually, use a laser and target the set up the laser to a very, very set frequency to extract exactly what you need, from the panels. And that basically allows you to be very economical, very green, and then you don't necessarily need to have, all the sort of mechanical crushing, because, that mechanical recycling uses crushing after crushing after crushing after crushing, and then you've got some separation mechanisms either through chemical leaching or just magnetic separations, and it's not very clean. So I think there's better ways of doing it. So at the moment there's there's pilots being run, but I think that's the future. Again, for solar panel recycling, you have to bear in mind that you don't have to recycle right now. The bulk will be in 2035, 2036. So we've got about 9 years to get ready for, the big, I would say, Armageddon of solar waste hitting the market. And that gives you about 9 years to work with the supply chain, to work with all the different industries in terms of supply side of raw materials, to see how you could integrate some of those key materials within the supply chain in the future, so that we're not left out with that huge mountain of waste without doing anything. It needs to be monetized. So we'll certainly be looking at all the different technologies and how we can improve the process between now and later. The key for the moment is to to meet the requirements of those big companies that are driving everything nowadays, the stock markets, our lives, our phones, our everything. And these guys have got requirements in terms of energy. So the United States will need to add, between now and 2040, about 300 gigawatts worth of power. I mean, you're all energy people, so you understand what 300 gigawatts is. And I was at the Nuclear Summit a couple of weeks ago, and in the room, it was one of the largest nuclear conference in the world. There was nearly 800 people. And there were basically a question for the audience: who thinks that there's going to be, let's say, 5 gigawatts of nuclear being built in the next 10 years? So everybody raised their hands. And the next question was, who thinks that there's going to be 10 gigawatts of nuclear built in the next 10 years? And then still a lot of people. But when the guy asked, hey, who thinks that there's going to be 15 gig of nuclear power being built in the next 10 years, then suddenly there was hardly anyone raising their hands. So the chance that we get 10 gigawatt from nuclear is, very real, but then you still have 290 gigawatts of power that needs to be produced in this country to meet demand from the population, but also the data centers and industry. And I do believe that looking at the scale and the rapidity and the speed of scaling that solar can offer, and solar is never going to be the only solution, but it's definitely part of the solution. I'm very bullish on solar. All right, 10 minutes, that's great. So the key requirements from these companies are basically considerate constructions. I think Andy said earlier, there's good developers and they're not as good developers, or I don't know, can't quite remember how you put it. But basically, it's all about making sure that you have a very ethical and considerate design system, that you're managing things properly during the lifetime of the installations. I've seen developers literally deforesting hundreds, if not 1,000 acres of beautiful, pristine Central Texas, post oaks, and there's no plan for the wood. These are the kind of the challenges that we're also facing. But I think there's ways of reutilizing, and there's a way of having a circular economy mindset to actually say, you know what, there was nature here, nature has its purpose, we can actually take that wood and repurpose that wood and do something with it and actually be responsible about it. And I think that there's a lot of companies that will start being exposed, and there's going to be a reputational risk associated with potentially doing stuff the wrong way. So I think it's very important to do things properly. I think they're going to ask for end-of-life management. We're seeing it nowadays. Microsoft goes to, for Microsoft, it's very important. They buy a huge amount of carbon credits every year. Now, when they're signing a PPA for 350 megawatts or 300 meg, 250 meg, they go and ask the developer. They say, okay, I need you to actually have a recycling contract. Otherwise, you can't do that. You need to have a plan for the future. So that's where we can come into place. Put containers on the sites where people can actually put the panels that are broken into one place, and you can physically demonstrate, to everyone that you're really responsible when it comes to your recycling programs and your end-of-life program. There's also compliance with local recycling requirements in the state of California, Washington, Maine, and North Carolina. And the key is really to have full compliance with sustainable finance requirements. So usually there will be a finance institution that will be in charge of deploying the capital for those things. And it's quite important to ask whether or not these investments are subject to EU taxonomy or not, because if they are, you really do need to have a plan right now and for tomorrow when it comes to recycling. The other thing is, which I think is quite good for developers, is to provide a biodiversity assessment, because if you're going to be literally deforesting 1,000 acres of, pristine land, you need to have a plan for what to do with it. So what the future looks like, I think, the key is to provide physical evidence that there's a recycling program, not just say, hey, we recycle our panel, but then you look at the site and then suddenly you can see that there's a mountain of used panels that are leaching on the floor, that needs to be used, that needs to be put in a container, that needs to be managed properly, and then there needs to be a proper supply chain for it. I think the having in-situ containers will also reduce the cost of dealing with the waste, because at the moment, the waste companies are charging a huge amount of money, $70,000 per megawatt to send it to landfill, and about up to $200,000 per megawatt for recycling. So there's a huge gate fee. My business model is very different in the sense that, there will be almost a subscription. We would send the container, you put all your panels in the containers, when they're broken or when they need to be, removed. You could give us a call. There's a QR code that would be on the container. There would be full traceability that will be blockchain enabled so that we can do the full traceability if, I don't know, the aluminum, ends up in another product. At least we'll be able to trace everything from its source. And then, having that sort of subscription model is quite good, because you don't need to, you're not subject to those things. The other thing that I want to do is to give a share of revenue of the materials. So, obviously silver is trading at 1.5 million a ton. You've got aluminium that has a lot of value, antimony with a lot of value as well. I don't see any reason why some of that money could be going back to the developer or the asset owner or the local communities, to basically boost local education, health, and well-being, or any other, programs. There'll be no gate fees, and there'll also going to be a possibility. What I think is going to happen is a lot of those plants that have got a lifespan of 25 years, a lot of those Brookfield, Blackstone, will come to almost the end of the year. They won't want to deal with the decommissioning. We've seen it with all the big oil and gas offshore platforms, that it becomes a liability, it becomes an issue, and it's quite hard to manage. And therefore, I think that there's going to be a big business case for repowering. The panels nowadays are 40% more efficient and 60% cheaper than they used to be, back in the days. So it means that a 25 megawatts back in the days would be a 40 megawatts in terms of, density of land. The reinstallation cost, if you can actually reuse some of the mounting systems. And in some countries in Europe, the real key is not necessarily, to Andy's point earlier, getting the grid connection and getting all the permits and the approvals in a very regulatory environment is worth gold, essentially. So, getting those assets, purchasing them 5 years before their end of lives, having a plan for the recycling, and actually giving a higher density power and a new life, a new 25 years of power, and maybe with panels that will be, coming from recycled materials or recycled panels, that would be even better, to really accelerate the process of, circularity. And then I think traceability is everything. You need to be able to see where things come from nowadays to avoid reputational risk. There's a huge amount of value in the carbon credits associated with the avoided emissions from the mining that's not going to take place for reusing those materials. The carbon credits, from this are, trading from, I don't know, at the moment, anything from $50 a ton of carbon to 100. And there's a lot of companies out there that will be willing to purchase those carbon credits, because we've seen earlier that there is an embodied carbon element associated with it. And then remanufacturing, I think, there's a lot of very good materials, in the panels that can be used for defense, automotive, energy, construction industries. So the idea is to, take the materials out there as they are. You can enrich some of the materials, and you can purify some of the materials, and then put them back on the supply chain to make sure that you get the best value for it. So the vision, we talked about the Permian Basin earlier, and the idea for us is to put our first site for Revolt Energy, which is the new vehicle that I founded recently. The site is located in the Permian Basin, so the idea is to have a socio-economic mission associated with it, partnering with a foundation to basically boost long-term employment and, thinking about the energy sector beyond extraction of oil and gas. What I'm spending a lot of time doing at the moment is securing waste management contracts with O&M companies, developers, and manufacturers. So if you own PV plants, or if you are an O&M company, or if you know anyone with a lot of solar panels, and you're interested in having a highly ethical, responsible way of dealing with your waste, then come and talk to me. But again, it's also about keeping investing and investigating in the technologies to make sure that we're ready for 2035. So we don't need to have the solution right now, but we have to plan for the future. And then obviously, we see a lot of batteries that are now being made with silicon anodes, and there's loads of different innovations in batteries. And there's also a lot of lithium in the Permian Basin. So, my vision is kind of recycling solar panels, recycling batteries, and creating the Permian, like in the Permian Basin, creating a massive hub for America for the batteries of tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.